The whirring of the CT scanner filled the sterile room with a dull hum, rhythmic and mechanical. Walter Granger lay perfectly still, his head cradled in the padded trough, eyes closed. The technician glanced at the screen, expecting the usual, perhaps a little calcification, maybe a vessel out of line. But then something caught his eye, a small object, dense, unusual. He leaned closer. "Hey, Dr. Jenkins," he called across the room. The doctor, a man in his late 40s with tired eyes and the steady gait of someone used to emergencies, walked over, coffee in hand. He looked at the monitor, then frowned. His brow creased deeper with every second he stared. "Is that metal?" he muttered. The technician nodded slowly. "It's lodged behind the occipital bone. Doesn't look like a surgical implant." "It's irregular." Dr. Jenkins stepped back, set his coffee down. "Pull up the contrast. Enhance that section." The screen sharpened, revealing a jagged shard, less than an inch long but unmistakably foreign. Not only that, it appeared to have markings on it. Letters, numbers. Almost eroded with time. Dr. Jenkins felt a chill run down his spine. Get the trauma unit on call, and notify neurology. "But he came in for headaches," the technician said. "He thought it was just stress." "Yeah," Jenkins murmured. "And he's been living with this for over 50 years. Outside the imaging room, Walter's son Michael sat with his teenage daughter, Emma, scrolling through photos on her phone. She looked up. "Dad," she whispered, "is Grandpa going to be okay?" Michael glanced toward the hallway, where two nurses were whispering, throwing nervous glances toward the screen. "I don't know, Em," he said, standing up. "I think something's wrong." When Dr. Jenkins walked out, his face was pale. "Mr. Granger," he said to Michael, "we need to talk, privately." Inside the small consultation room, Jenkins pulled up the scan on a tablet. "What we found," he began, "is a foreign metallic object embedded at the base of your father's skull. It appears to have been there for decades. Given its shape and location, it's likely shrapnel, possibly from a mortar or grenade fragment." Michael stared at the screen. "But that's impossible. My dad never mentioned being injured." "Did your father serve in the military?" Jenkins asked carefully. Michael nodded. "Yeah. He was in Vietnam, Marine Corps, but he never talked about it, not once." The doctor turned the tablet toward him again. "There are markings on the fragment. It's faint, but we believe it says VN-68. That would match ordnance used during the Vietnam War, circa 1968. Michael felt the air thicken. 60 years, he whispered. "He's had that inside him for 60 years. Dr. Jenkins continued. "It's remarkable, actually. Most people would have suffered serious symptoms long before now. The fact that he's only recently experiencing pain suggests the fragment has shifted. It's now pressing on nerve clusters, which could explain the headaches and occasional memory lapses." Michael couldn't process it all. "So what happens now?" "We'll need to schedule surgery," Jenkins said, carefully. "It's not without risks, especially at his age. But the real question is, how did it get there without being documented? No medical records, no mention of surgery, no follow-up." Michael's voice dropped. "He never told us much about the war. Mom used to say it haunted him, but he'd shut down every time we asked." Jenkins stood up. "This is more than just a medical case. This is history embedded in a man's body." Back in the recovery room, Walter was awake, unaware of the commotion outside. Emma slipped in quietly and sat beside him. "You okay, Grandpa?" Walter smiled faintly. "Tired, but better now that you're here." Emma hesitated. "They found something. In your head." Walter chuckled dryly. "Well, I always said there was something loose up there." "No, seriously," she insisted. "A piece of metal. The doctors think it's from the war." Walter's smile faded. His hand twitched. His eyes drifted toward the window beyond the trees to somewhere far away. "Is it true?" Emma asked. "Were you hurt?" He said nothing, just stared, because even now, more than 5 decades later, the war wasn't done with him. And soon it would speak again, through the shard of metal buried in his body like a secret too stubborn to die. Walter Granger's house sat at the end of a quiet gravel road in Colorado Springs, perched between a grove of pine trees and the edge of a dry creek. It wasn't large, nor particularly modern, but it was immaculately kept, clean, minimal, and orderly, like the man himself. He woke each morning at 5:30 a.m., like he had for most of his life, without the need for an alarm. The kettle went on at 6. Black tea, 2 sugars, no milk. At 6:30, he'd take a slow walk to the end of the driveway, where the local paper was dropped, though lately he didn't read much beyond the headlines. The world felt distant, loud, unrecognizable. Walter had lived alone for the better part of 30 years. His wife Margaret had passed from ovarian cancer in 1994. Since then, the house had stayed almost exactly the same. Her photo remained above the fireplace, her smile forever paused in that moment before their wedding in '65. The mantel also held an old brass compass, a folded American flag in a triangular case, and a black and white photo of Walter in uniform, standing alongside his Marine unit in Vietnam. He never remarried. Never really tried. He said he'd already lived a whole lifetime in the jungle, and anything after that felt like echoes. Despite his age, Walter still moved with discipline. Every corner of the house was tidy. His tools were labeled, the pantry stocked with military precision. The way he lived suggested he was a man still prepared for something, though what that was, nobody quite knew. Michael, his son, used to joke that if the world ever ended, Grandpa's house would be the safest place on earth. But jokes rarely landed with Walter. He wasn't cold, not exactly, just unreadable. He spoke when needed, smiled politely, but he never really opened up. Michael had grown up in that silence. As a boy, he would sit at the kitchen table, swinging his legs, waiting for his dad to say something about the war. But Walter never did. If the subject was brought up, he'd either excuse himself or change topics. Once, when Michael was 12, he'd asked directly, "Did you ever kill anyone?" Walter's face had darkened, and he'd replied, "Don't ask questions you're not ready to live with." That was the last time Michael ever asked. The emotional wall only grew thicker after Margaret died. Father and son drifted. Michael moved to Chicago for college, then law school. Phone calls turned into voicemails. Holidays turned into brief visits. There were no big fights, just a quiet erosion. Still, Walter wasn't without feeling. He just didn't wear it openly. When Emma was born, Michael's daughter, Walter sent a letter typed with his old typewriter, congratulating them and enclosing a tiny hand-carved wooden horse. He didn't say where he got it, or why a horse, but Michael kept it. Walter saw Emma occasionally, maybe once or twice a year. She was the only one who could bring out the softer parts of him. Small smiles, shared jokes, even stories that hinted at his younger self. Once he'd told her about a dog he'd had in Vietnam, a half-starved mutt named Beans that followed the unit around. Emma had laughed for minutes when he described Beans stealing a sandwich from the lieutenant's pack and running through a minefield to keep it. That was the closest anyone had ever gotten to the war story. Walter didn't attend veteran parades. He didn't join the VFW. When people asked if he'd served, he'd nod, then turn away. The medals he'd earned, 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart, sat in a locked drawer in the bedroom. He wasn't ashamed, but he wasn't proud either. There was something about surviving what so many didn't that left him feeling hollow, unworthy. As if by coming back, he'd failed those who hadn't. And so he kept his memories sealed tight, like old ammunition, too dangerous to handle, too loud to forget. At night he would sit by the window, nursing tea, staring out at the trees, sometimes humming softly. No one knew the tune, maybe not even him. And behind his left ear, right at the base of his skull, was what he thought was a birthmark, or maybe a stubborn mole. He never paid it much attention. It had been there for as long as he could remember. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that it was the last piece of a war he had spent his life trying to forget. And now it had come back. It began with the headaches. They weren't sharp or blinding, not at first. Just a dull pressure at the back of his head, like someone pressing 2 fingers behind his skull and refusing to let go. At first, Walter brushed it off. He told himself it was dehydration, or maybe the weather. Colorado winters had always been strange, shifting from dry cold to sharp wind overnight. He drank more water, took 2 aspirin, and went on with his day. But the pressure returned the next morning, and again the day after that. By the end of the week, the pain had crept lower, into his neck, then wrapped itself around the base of his skull like a vice. Turning his head to the left made his vision blur for a second, and twice, he'd forgotten where he'd placed his keys, something that had never happened before. He sat at the kitchen table one morning, gripping his teacup a little too tightly, staring into the steam. The room felt dimmer. The silence around him, usually comforting, had grown heavy, oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath. He reached back and pressed his fingers to that familiar spot behind his left ear. It had always been there, what he assumed was a birthmark or a mole. It felt different now, firmer, raised, almost as if something under the skin was pushing outward. He pressed again. A flash of pain shot through the base of his skull and down his neck, like lightning in slow motion. He jerked his hand away. Damn it, he whispered. He stood up, walked to the bathroom mirror, and turned his head. It was hard to see clearly, but the spot did seem darker, maybe even bruised around the edges. He leaned closer. The skin was taut, almost shiny, like it had been stretched. Still, he said nothing. That afternoon, he sat in his armchair, the same one he'd sat in for years, and turned on the local news. The anchor was discussing the recent memorial service for Vietnam veterans held downtown. Photos flashed across the screen, men in wheelchairs, saluting with trembling hands, wives holding faded pictures of young soldiers lost in faraway jungles. Walter's chest tightened. He changed the channel. That night, he had a dream. He was in the jungle again. Not just any jungle, Quang Tri, 1968. The air was thick, wet. There was shouting in the distance, gunfire. He turned to call out to Ray, his closest friend in the unit, but the name caught in his throat. And then came the explosion, louder than thunder, blinding. Something hot slammed into his head, and the world spun into blackness. He woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around his legs. For the first time in years, he sat up and turned on the light. He walked to the mirror again, pressed the spot behind his ear. It was throbbing, angry. He knew something was wrong. But old habits die hard. Marines don't complain. Marines don't whine about pain or run to the doctor over a bump. And Walter Granger had survived a war by learning to ignore what hurt. That mindset had saved his life once. Now, it was quietly working against him. He reached for a bottle of Tylenol, washed it down with cold tap water, and stared out the window into the dark. Outside, the pines swayed gently in the wind. Inside, something inside him stirred, and not just the pain. Something older, something buried. The knock on the door came just after 9 on Saturday morning. Walter wasn't expecting anyone. He moved slower than usual, shoulders stiff, the back of his neck aching as he shuffled toward the entryway. When he opened the door, there they were, Michael and Emma, standing with coffee in hand and an overnight bag at their feet. Michael smiled tightly. Surprise. Walter blinked. What are you doing here? Emma rushed forward and hugged him before he could object. Grandpa, you look thinner. Walter chuckled lightly, resting a hand on her shoulder. Well, I haven't changed my eating habits. Maybe your eyes have. Michael stepped in, holding up a white paper bag. We brought breakfast. Figured it was time for a check-in. Walter knew better. His son never just showed up, especially not unannounced. He didn't argue, though. He stepped aside and let them in. Over coffee and half a muffin, they made small talk. Work, school, gas prices. The usual meaningless bridges built to delay something more difficult. Emma wandered into the living room, flipping through the photo album on the shelf. Hey, Dad, she called out. Grandpa's got pictures from Vietnam here. I thought you said he never talked about it? Michael glanced at Walter, then looked away. He doesn't. Emma frowned. Well, someone took these. Walter remained silent. He sipped his coffee and stared out the window. Eventually, the subject turned. Michael leaned forward. Dad, he said quietly, you sound tired. I'm 78. I've earned the right. Michael didn't laugh. Emma said you forgot where the light switch was yesterday. Walter didn't answer. And she told me you looked like you were in pain when you turned your head. Walter's eyes narrowed slightly. You had her spying on me? No, Michael said firmly. She cares about you. So do I. That's why we're here. There was a long pause. I'm fine, Walter muttered. No, Michael said, you're not. Something's wrong, and we both know it. Walter clenched his jaw. The pressure at the back of his head had been worse that morning, radiating like a pulse, but he wasn't about to admit it. Emma sat beside him on the couch. Grandpa, please. She reached out, gently brushing aside the collar of his shirt. Her fingers touched the back of his neck. Ow, he winced, recoiling slightly. Emma pulled her hand back. It's swollen. Michael stood. That's it. We're going to the hospital. No, Walter said sharply. I'm not some invalid you can push into a clinic. Michael crossed his arms. You're not indestructible either. You've got something growing behind your skull. You've been having headaches, forgetting things. You can't keep brushing this off. I've had worse, Walter snapped. Emma's voice broke through, soft and clear, but not alone. The room fell silent. Walter stared at her, this girl who barely knew his story but somehow understood him better than most. He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Just a checkup. That's it. Nothing fancy. Michael nodded. Fine, just a checkup. But all three of them knew. They were chasing more than just a diagnosis. They were chasing a ghost. The hospital was newer than Walter expected. Clean, sterile, filled with soft voices and the quiet beeping of machines. He hated it instantly. Michael helped him fill out the intake forms while Emma sat nearby, nervously thumbing the hem of her hoodie. Walter didn't say much. He kept rubbing the back of his neck as though the pain could be coaxed into silence by sheer will. When the nurse called his name, he stood on his own. Always on his own. Inside the exam room, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above. A young physician's assistant, cheerful and overly polite, introduced herself as Taylor and began taking his vitals. "Blood pressure's a little elevated," she said. "Any pain today?" Walter hesitated. "Headache. Dull. Been off and on for a couple weeks," she nodded, typing quickly. "Any nausea? Changes in vision? Memory issues?" Michael answered before Walter could. "He's been forgetful, and he mentioned dizziness a couple days ago." Walter shot him a look. Taylor raised an eyebrow. "Any recent injuries? Falls?" "No," Walter said. "Nothing recent." She stepped behind him, gently pressing her fingers to the base of his skull. He winced when she reached the raised bump just left of the center. "That's tender," she noted. "It feels firm, like not just a cyst or fatty tissue. We'll want imaging." Taylor stepped out and returned with Dr. Jenkins, a tall man with silver at his temples and the calm voice of someone who had seen a lot and was surprised by little. He examined Walter briefly, then ordered a CT scan and full neurological evaluation. "Just to be safe," he said. Walter didn't protest. He was too tired. The scan took place 20 minutes later. Walter lay flat in the machine, staring up at the white ceiling as the circular tube spun above his head. It hummed like a distant engine, constant and dispassionate. As the machine worked, Michael stood behind the glass window, watching. He could see Walter's face, still unreadable, like always, but there was a tension there that hadn't been present before. The scan finished. Walter was wheeled out, and the technician told them to wait while the radiologist reviewed the results. It didn't take long. Less than 10 minutes later, Dr. Jenkins walked in with a tablet in hand and a look that was just a bit too serious. "I need to show you both something," he said, gesturing them into a small conference room just off the imaging wing. On the screen, the scan appeared. Grayscale, a side view of Walter's skull. Jenkins zoomed in near the base. "There," he said, tapping. "Just below the occipital bone, near the foramen magnum. That's the opening where the spinal cord passes through." Walter squinted. "What am I looking at?" "That," Jenkins said, "is not part of your anatomy." It was a small shard. Metallic, sharp-edged, about 3/4 of an inch long, embedded in soft tissue, surrounded by a halo of slight inflammation. "It's metal?" Michael asked. Jenkins nodded. "Yes. Likely ferrous. And here's where it gets stranger." He zoomed in further. Though grainy, they could make out faint markings, some sort of engraving, almost entirely eroded by time. "Looks like a serial number," Jenkins said. "We've submitted it for forensic analysis, but, well, I've seen fragments like this before. Not recently. Usually in veterans." Michael looked at his father. "Could that be from the war?" Walter was silent. Jenkins continued. "If it is, and it's been in there this long, it's a miracle you haven't had worse symptoms. But it's shifted. That could explain the headaches. And if it keeps moving, it could compromise the brainstem." Walter finally spoke. "So what do you suggest?" "We need to remove it," Jenkins said, carefully. "We'll need to schedule surgery within the next few days." Michael took a breath. "Is it dangerous?" "There are risks," Jenkins said, "but leaving it in is more dangerous now." He paused, then looked back at Walter. "Mr. Granger, with all due respect, why didn't you know this was in you?" Walter's eyes didn't leave the screen. "I thought it was a mole," he said simply. Jenkins exhaled through his nose. "We'll run more tests tonight. Start pre-op blood work. Keep you under observation until we're ready." As the doctor left, Michael turned to his father. "You really didn't know?" Walter shook his head. "I knew something was wrong. I just didn't want it to be what I feared." Michael lowered his voice. "What did you fear?" Walter looked away. "That it never left me." The hospital lights dimmed for the night, but Walter couldn't sleep. He lay in the bed, the monitors beeping quietly, the smell of antiseptic and cotton swabs thick in the air. A nurse had drawn his blood earlier. Another had checked his pulse. But now, all was still, except for the roar inside his head. The pain had dulled, but something else rose in its place. A weight, not physical, but deep and old. Like a voice calling from beneath the earth. And then, without warning, memory opened like a door. The jungle was alive again. Vietnam, February 1968, just outside Khe Sanh. The rain had fallen for 3 days straight. The red mud clung to everything. Boots, rifles, fingers. It soaked through the flak vests and turned the bunkers into shallow graves. The air stank of mildew, cordite, and something rotting just beyond the wire. Walter crouched in a trench, his M16 balanced across his knees, listening to the steady thump of artillery in the distance. Every so often, the horizon would flash orange. The North Vietnamese army had been pounding the base perimeter day and night. And the Tet offensive had only made things worse. It was chaos across the country. Beside him sat Ray Kelly, tall, wiry, from Indiana, married just before shipping out. Ray had a photo of his wife tucked inside his helmet liner. He used to take it out every night, even when the mortar fire was raining down. Said it kept him sane. Hell of a Valentine's Day, huh? Ray muttered, flicking mud from the muzzle of his rifle. Walter didn't answer. He was staring out past the wire, at the trees swaying like ghosts in the fog. Something felt off. The jungle was too quiet. You think they'll hit us tonight? Ray asked. Walter shrugged. They already hit us last night. That ain't a no. A few moments passed. Rain patted down on their helmets, soft but relentless. Somewhere far off, a flare hissed into the sky, casting an eerie green light over the terrain. Walter adjusted his helmet. Something's coming. I feel it. Yeah, Ray said, checking his ammo. I feel it too. The explosion came less than a minute later. No warning, no countdown, just a ripping sound, like the sky tearing apart, and then the world shattered. Walter was thrown backward, his head slamming into the dirt wall of the trench. His ears rang. The world spun. He felt heat at the base of his skull, but it didn't register fully. He couldn't move. For a moment he thought he was dead. Then he heard someone screaming, "Ray." Walter blinked. The sky above him was spinning, red and green, fire and smoke. His rifle was gone. Mud filled his mouth. He tried to sit up, and pain exploded behind his left ear. He reached back and felt something wet, sticky. He pulled his hand away. Blood. Everything inside him told him to lie still, to close his eyes and let go. But something stronger pushed him upright. Ray was crawling, dragging one leg behind him, his face pale, smeared with dirt and blood. He pointed to the tree line. They were coming, shadows, dozens of them, maybe more. Walter picked up a nearby M79 launcher, someone else's, dropped in the blast, and fired blind toward the tree line. The thump 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 of return fire cracked over their heads. Bullets slapped the mud inches from Ray's hands. Go, Ray shouted. But Walter didn't move. He grabbed Ray by the shoulder, slung the man's arm over his neck, and hauled him toward the nearest sandbag wall. Each step was agony. The pain in his head grew sharper, brighter, like a hot needle digging deeper into his skull. Somehow they made it. A medic found them minutes later and yelled for help. The last thing Walter remembered was the medic leaning over him, shouting something he couldn't hear. Then blackness. When Walter woke, it was still dark, but it wasn't night. He was lying in a canvas medical tent, the smell of antiseptic and blood thick in the air. Moans echoed around him, young men, wounded, some missing limbs, others whispering names of people who weren't there. A corpsman leaned over him. You're lucky, the man said, wrapping a bandage around Walter's head. Blast caught the side of your skull, but nothing vital. You blacked out for a bit, took a bad fall. Walter tried to speak, but his mouth felt full of sand. Don't talk, the corpsman said. Save your strength. You're being rotated out tomorrow. Ray? Walter rasped. The corpsman looked down, paused, then shook his head. They couldn't save him. Walter closed his eyes. Something inside him went silent then, like a switch being flipped. Not grief, not yet, just silence. He stayed in the tent for another 12 hours. Then he was shipped out by helicopter to Da Nang. No surgery, no scans, just stitches, rest, and a pat on the back. There were too many wounded, not enough time. No one asked if he remembered the blast. No one checked if there was anything left inside his skull. The bleeding had stopped. The vitals were stable. Good enough. He returned to his unit 2 weeks later. By then, the jungle had reclaimed the trench. The bunkers were rebuilt. The men he'd known were scattered, reassigned, or buried. Walter never told anyone about the pain behind his ear. It was manageable. Just a throb, and with everything else, the ambushes, the long marches, the unending rain, it felt small, but it never went away. Even years later, when the war ended and the uniforms were packed away, the ache remained. Sometimes sharp, sometimes dull, but always there. A reminder, he came home in 1969 to a country that didn't want to hear his stories. Protests filled the streets. People called them murderers, baby killers. The same airport that once waved goodbye now watched them return with scowls and silence. Walter stopped wearing his medals, stopped telling people where he'd been, stopped speaking about Ray. He married Margaret in 1970. She knew he'd been in Vietnam. She never asked for details. Once, she'd touched the back of his head, asked if the scar hurt. He'd said no. That was the last time anyone mentioned it. Years passed. Michael was born. Walter worked as a mechanic, kept his head down, paid his taxes. He went to PTA meetings, fixed the roof, painted the porch, lived like a man who had never been in a war. But it was always there, behind his left ear. A constant whisper. Some nights he'd wake up and reach for his helmet, before realizing he was in bed, safe, thousands of miles from the jungle. Other nights he'd hear Ray's voice. Just the name, Walt, spoken in a tone only the dying use. And now, 55 years later, lying in a hospital bed in Colorado, that same ache had returned. Only this time it had a face, a shape, a history. Walter stared at the ceiling and whispered into the dark. "I didn't forget you, Ray. I just couldn't speak, because silence had been the only thing that kept him whole. Until now, the surgical suite was cold, not unpleasantly so, just clinical, sterile. As if temperature alone could keep the chaos of the human body in check. Walter lay motionless on the table, his head secured in a padded brace. The team moved around him with practiced efficiency, nurses prepping instruments, the anesthesiologist monitoring vitals, Dr. Jenkins double-checking imaging scans on a monitor nearby. Everything was ready. "Are we good on anesthesia?" Jenkins asked. "Fully under," the nurse confirmed. "Vitals stable." "All right, let's begin." He made the first incision behind Walter's left ear, small, careful, just below the swelling. Blood rose immediately, but not dangerously. Jenkins worked slowly, parting muscle and connective tissue with a surgeon's grace. He'd done this kind of procedure dozens of times, but something about this one felt different. "Retractor," he said calmly, and the assistant handed it over. Layer by layer, they worked closer to the base of the skull. The deeper they went, the tighter the air seemed to grow. No one spoke unless necessary. Then, he saw it. A flicker of dull gray against the red. Jenkins froze. "There it is," he whispered. It looked like a shard of metal, jagged, wedged in tightly, glinting faintly under the surgical light. The tissue around it was thick with scar formation, as if the body had long ago accepted the intruder as part of itself. "How the hell did that stay hidden for 50 years?" murmured the scrub nurse beside him. "Carefully," Jenkins said. "Forceps." He reached in, gripping the exposed edge. The fragment resisted at first, like a stubborn root deep in old soil. Then, with a slow tug and a soft tearing sound, it slid free. The room went still. Jenkins held it up. It wasn't just a piece of shrapnel, it was unmistakably military, a chunk of a casing, maybe from a mortar or small explosive. It had weight, shape, purpose. And then they saw the markings. "Wait," the tech said, leaning in. "Is that engraving?" The room seemed to tilt. There, along one edge, almost too faint to notice, were a few worn letters and numbers, etched in rusted steel. VN68 B.MFG02. Us. The silence was thunderous. Jenkins turned the piece in his gloved hand. "Vietnam, 1968. This is a war artifact." He looked down at Walter, still unconscious, chest rising and falling beneath the surgical drape. This man had carried a piece of history in his head for over half a century, and no one had known. "Document it," Jenkins said quickly. "Get a sterile container, mark everything. Photograph the object before and after cleaning. Chain of custody starts now." The nurse obeyed, but her hands shook slightly. Another assistant murmured, "I've never seen anything like this. Not outside a museum." Jenkins nodded, still staring at the fragment. He was a Marine. That thing's been part of his body longer than some of us have been alive. One of the monitors beeped. Walter's heart rate spiked slightly, then settled again. "Vitals holding steady," the anesthesiologist said. Jenkins turned his focus back to the surgical field. "All right, let's finish up. We've still got closure and post-op ahead." But the tone in the room had changed. No longer just professionals in a sterile ballet. Now they were witnesses, participants in a moment that blurred the line between medicine and history. As Jenkins began suturing the incision, he couldn't help but wonder, how had the man lived with that thing inside him? How had no one noticed before? And what kind of silence must he have carried to never say a word? When the final stitch was in place, Jenkins stepped back, peeled off his gloves, and looked down at Walter. "Rest easy, Marine," he murmured. "You've carried it long enough." In the prep area, the fragment sat sealed in a clear evidence tube, cleaned and catalogued, but still ancient, still sacred, in a way no lab could measure. A nurse took a photo, then paused. "What should we do with it?" Jenkins looked at her. "We give it back. It happened in the middle of the night. Walter had been in recovery for 6 hours. The surgery had gone well, by all accounts flawlessly. The fragment was removed, the wound closed, the vitals steady. Michael and Emma had gone home to get some rest, reluctantly, after much convincing from the nurses. They hadn't even unpacked their overnight bags when the phone rang. Michael answered on the first ring. "This is Michael Granger. Mr. Granger, this is ICU at St. Francis. Your father has developed a postoperative complication. His blood pressure dropped suddenly, and he's unresponsive. We're moving him back into critical care. You should come in immediately." Michael's heart seemed to stop for half a beat. "We're on our way." By the time they arrived, the corridors were dim and quiet, the hospital washed in that strange gray that only appears after midnight. They were led to a waiting room near the ICU, too bright, too clean, too filled with the wrong kind of silence. Dr. Jenkins met them minutes later, his face pale with concern. "There's been some internal bleeding," he explained. "It wasn't visible during surgery, very small, deep set, but it appears a vein along the occipital artery ruptured. It happens sometimes, especially with trauma this old. The inflammation around the fragment masked the risk." Michael struggled to follow. "But, is he going to be okay?" Jenkins hesitated. "We've stabilized him for now. He's not awake. His heart is strong, but his pressure is low. We're monitoring him closely." Emma sat beside her father, holding his hand. "Can we see him?" Jenkins nodded. "Just for a moment. He's sedated, on oxygen." When they entered the ICU, Walter looked smaller than before. The man who once stood like iron now seemed fragile, all edges softened by tubes and monitors. A breathing mask covered his face. His skin was pale, almost translucent under the fluorescent lights. Michael stepped to the bedside, resting a hand on his father's arm. "I never got to say anything," he whispered. Emma blinked up at him. "Say it now, he might still hear you." Michael nodded, swallowing hard. "Hey, Dad, it's me." He looked at the lines on the monitor, steady but low. "I never told you this, but I always wanted to be like you, even when I didn't understand you, even when I thought you didn't care." His voice cracked. "I was mad, you know, for a long time because you never talked about anything. You didn't tell me about the war, about Mom, about how much pain you were carrying." Emma leaned her head on his shoulder. "I thought you didn't want me to know you," Michael said, "but maybe you were just trying to protect us from whatever it was that stayed inside you." A nurse stepped in quietly. "You can stay as long as you like, but if his pressure drops further, we may need to make some hard decisions." Michael nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They stayed by Walter's side through the night. Every hour, a nurse came in, adjusted a drip, checked vitals, whispered updates that felt both clinical and terrifying. Around 4 a.m., Walter's oxygen levels dipped. Alarms beeped. A team rushed in. Michael and Emma were moved to the hallway, hearts pounding. From behind the glass, they could see the team working, calm but quick, hands moving like clockwork. Emma gripped Michael's hand. "Is he dying?" "I don't know," Michael whispered. In that moment, Michael's mind drifted to the last Thanksgiving they spent together. Walter had said almost nothing the entire dinner. Just sat at the end of the table, occasionally refilling his coffee. Michael had been so frustrated. He remembered thinking, why does he even come if he won't talk? Now he understood. Walter hadn't been absent. He'd been broken, but he'd still shown up. Still tried. The glass door opened, and Jenkins stepped out, rubbing his eyes. "We've stabilized him again," he said. "He's still unconscious, but it's holding." Michael exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Thank you," he said quietly. Jenkins nodded, his voice softer now. "Your father, he's a tough man. Most people wouldn't have survived with a fragment like that inside them for so long. His body adapted, compensated. That kind of endurance, it's rare." Michael looked through the glass again, at the man who had built fences with bare hands, who had carried his silence like armor. "I think he's been surviving his whole life," he said. Jenkins offered a tired smile. "Maybe now he can finally start living." Walter woke to the quiet hum of machines. The room was still dark, save for the soft glow of monitors and the faint light filtering in from the hallway. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The ceiling was smooth. No jungle canopy, no mortar fire, no screaming, just silence. And then, the pain reminded him. Not sharp anymore, just a steady ache near the base of his skull, like a dull reminder that something had been taken out, something that had lived there for over half a century. He turned his head slightly and saw Michael, slouched in a chair beside the bed, asleep with his jacket draped over him. Emma was curled up on the couch, her hoodie pulled over her face. Walter blinked. The last thing he remembered was the light above the surgical table. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. He reached for the cup on the tray, but his hand trembled, barely lifting. Michael stirred, rubbed his eyes, and sat up. "Dad," he said softly, moving to the bedside. Walter gave a slight nod. "You're okay," Michael breathed. "You scared the hell out of us." Walter's lips curled slightly. "Wouldn't be the first time." Michael managed a laugh, though it was tight with emotion. "I thought you weren't coming back," he said. Walter looked at his son, really looked at him, taking in the worry carved into the lines on his face, the exhaustion in his eyes. He saw the little boy that used to run around the yard, chasing fireflies, the boy he'd never quite known how to talk to. "I almost didn't," Walter said quietly. Michael pulled the chair closer. "They found the fragment," he continued. "They showed us. It had markings. From the war." Walter closed his eyes for a moment. "I know. You carried it for all these years," Michael said. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" Walter exhaled slowly. "Because talking about it made it real." Michael waited. Walter turned his head slightly toward the ceiling. "Khasan, Tet Offensive, February 68. We'd been hit every night for a week. Mortars, snipers, ambushes. It was hell." His voice was gravel, slow but steady. "I was in the trench with Ray Kelly, Indiana boy. He used to hum this dumb tune all the time. I've been working on the railroad. Drove me nuts." He paused, eyes fixed on some invisible point above him. "That night, we knew something was coming. I could feel it. Ray could too." Walter swallowed. The blast came fast, no warning. "I remember the sound, like the world snapping in two." His hand twitched beneath the blanket. "I blacked out. Woke up in a medical tent. Ray was gone." Michael said nothing. "They patched me up, didn't scan, didn't dig too deep. We were bodies then, numbers. I went back to the line 2 weeks later." He closed his eyes again. "I kept feeling the pain, that ache, but I thought, maybe it was just memory. I never imagined it was still there, inside me." Michael leaned forward. "Why didn't you tell Mom, or me?" Walter looked at him, the corners of his mouth tight. "Because when I came home, no one wanted to hear about Vietnam. People spat at us, called us monsters. Your mother, she was kind. She knew, but she never pushed." His voice softened. "And you were just a kid. I didn't want to stain you with it." Michael shook his head. "You didn't stain me, you shut me out." Walter didn't flinch. "I didn't know how to let you in." There was a long silence between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy, honest. Then Walter spoke again. "I was ashamed I survived." Michael looked up. "What do you mean?" "I came back, and Ray didn't. Half my unit didn't. I carried that thing inside me all these years like, maybe it should have killed me, maybe it was supposed to." His voice cracked. "But it didn't. And I didn't know how to live with that." Michael stood, took his father's hand. "You did live, and you raised me, and now, you don't have to carry it alone anymore." Emma stirred from the couch, rubbing her eyes, her hair tangled from sleep. She sat up and looked toward the bed. When she saw Walter awake, talking, she moved quickly, barefoot on the hospital tile. "Grandpa?" Walter turned his head toward her, his face softening in a way Michael had never seen. "Hey, kiddo," he rasped. She rushed to his side, gently hugging the arm that wasn't attached to IVs. "You're okay," she whispered. "They said you might not wake up." Walter gave a tired smile. "I'm hard to get rid of." Emma blinked away tears. "I was so scared." "I know," he said quietly. "I'm sorry for that." She pulled the chair close, sitting beside her father. The three of them sat in a strange sacred triangle, 3 generations bound together by blood and silence. Emma looked at him, her voice tentative. Dad said, "You had something in your head. From the war?" Walter nodded. "A piece of metal. Stayed with me a long time. Was it from when you got hurt?" He hesitated, then said, "It was from a day I've tried to forget, but I think I needed to remember." Emma studied him, her expression full of more empathy than most adults could muster. "Did it hurt?" "Not always," Walter said. "Sometimes it just hummed. Like a reminder." Emma looked down at his hand. "I never knew you were in pain." Walter sighed. "That was my fault. I didn't want you or your dad to see me as broken." "You're not broken," she said, eyes fierce. "You're my grandpa. You're the strongest person I know." He chuckled, and it turned into a cough. Michael handed him water, and Walter took a slow sip. Then, with a steady voice, he said, "There's something else I need to say." He looked at Michael first. "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, more powerful than any explosion. "I'm sorry I wasn't the father you needed. I didn't know how to talk about what I'd seen. I thought if I stayed quiet, it wouldn't touch you. But I see now, it touched you anyway. Michael's eyes welled. I didn't need you to be perfect. I just needed you to be there. Walter nodded. I'm here now, if that still matters. It does, Michael said, more than ever. Then Walter turned to Emma. And I'm sorry you didn't know this part of me. The war, it shaped everything. How I see the world, how I raised your dad, how I loved your grandma. Emma held his hand tighter. You don't have to be sorry. I want to know, I want to understand you. Walter felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been clenched for decades. I'd like that, he said. They sat in silence for a while, letting the moment settle like fresh snow. Then Emma spoke. Will you tell me about Ray? Walter blinked. You want to hear that story? I think he's part of you, she said, and I want to know all of you. Walter stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then he nodded. Okay, he whispered. I'll tell you everything. Outside the window, dawn was breaking. The sky was painted in soft golds and blues, a quiet promise that something new had begun. Walter was discharged from the hospital 10 days after the surgery. He moved slower now, with a slight tilt to his gait and a cane that Emma insisted on decorating with Marine Corps stickers. But he was upright, alive, breathing freely. The pain behind his ear was gone, replaced by a thin, curved scar and a sense of strange lightness he hadn't known he'd been missing. Back at his house in Colorado Springs, things were the same, yet not. The tea kettle still whistled at 6 a.m., the porch still creaked under his boots, and the folded flag above the fireplace hadn't moved an inch. But something in the air had shifted. The silence that once ruled the place had loosened its grip. He wasn't alone anymore. Michael had extended his stay indefinitely, working remotely from the kitchen table. Emma came over every afternoon after school, sometimes with friends in tow, sometimes with just her laptop and a stack of questions. Was Ray the one who taught you how to play poker? She'd ask. No, Walter would smile. Ray cheated at poker. He taught me how to lose with dignity. They sat on the porch most evenings, Emma with her recorder on, Walter with a blanket over his lap and memories unfolding like faded maps. He spoke of jungles that breathed at night, of laughter in foxholes, of a dog named Beans that stole sandwiches and hearts. He spoke of fear, not the kind that makes you run, but the kind that sinks into your bones and makes you question your worth. He spoke of Ray, and for the first time the memories didn't hollow him out. They filled him, shaped him anew. Michael listened too, not always from the front row, sometimes just from the kitchen, pretending to stir soup that didn't need stirring. But he listened, and every now and then, he asked questions. What did you do your first day back home? Sat on the porch, Walter said, watched the wind move the grass, tried to remember how to feel normal. Michael nodded, understanding that more now than he ever could have as a boy. They started building something together, small at first, fixing the shed, clearing out the garage, going through old boxes, then bigger, plans for a trip, maybe even a reunion with other veterans. Walter wasn't ready yet, but he didn't say no. Emma convinced him to let her record the stories for a school project. That turned into a collection. That collection turned into a binder, and one day, Walter opened a fresh notebook, wrote the words Chapter 1, and didn't stop. They called it the Shrapnel that stayed. On the dedication page he wrote, For Ray, who stayed with me longer than I ever realized, and for those I shut out, thinking it would protect them. When it was finished, Emma printed a copy and handed it to him in a small ceremony in the backyard. There were only 3 chairs, a plate of cookies, and a small American flag on the table. But to Walter, it felt like a parade. Inside the house, on the bookshelf next to his photo in uniform, stood a glass case. Inside it, the metal fragment, clean and gleaming under a soft light. It rested on a velvet cloth, like an artifact in a museum. There was an inscription beneath it, printed in simple black letters, VN68, recovered, remembered, released. Sometimes, Walter would catch himself staring at it, not with bitterness, but with a strange affection. It had been part of him, a secret he didn't even know he was keeping. Now, it was just a piece of steel. The pain was gone. What remained was something else, something human. One afternoon, Emma asked, Do you believe things happen for a reason? Walter looked out at the trees, green with spring. I think some things happen because they must, he said, and the reason comes later, if we're lucky. Emma smiled. I think we were lucky. Walter reached over and gave her hand a squeeze. So do I. And that evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long golden rays across the porch, Walter sat with his family, Michael sipping coffee beside him, Emma sketching in a notebook, and felt, perhaps for the first time in decades, at peace. not because the past was gone, but because it was finally shared. Some wounds don't bleed, some scars don't show, and sometimes the heaviest burdens we carry are the ones no one else can see, not even ourselves. For Walter Granger, a fragment of war lodged in his body became a symbol of something deeper, the stories left untold, the grief buried beneath years of silence, the weight of survival that never quite let go. But survival is only the beginning. What comes after, the courage to remember, to speak, to reconnect, that's where healing begins. Walter's journey was not about a piece of metal. It was about what that metal represented. The decades he lived without saying a word, the distance between him and those who loved him, the lies so many of us tell ourselves, that silence protects others from pain. But in truth, silence isolates, and when we begin to share our fears, our failures, our history, we do something extraordinary. We pass on not just the pain, but the strength it took to endure it. So let me ask you, is there a story inside you that's been waiting too long to be told? Is there someone in your life, an elder, a parent, a friend, who carries something they've never put into words? Have you ever held back, thinking you were protecting others, when what they really needed was to understand you? Maybe this is the moment to break that silence. Maybe now is the time to talk, or to listen. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love, or a chapter you've hidden away, tell us. Share your thoughts in the comments. Share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story that speaks to the heart. Because in the end, that's what we're here to do. Not just to survive, but to be heard, to be seen, to be remembered.